Good evening. My name is Kadri Liik, and yes, I'm the first director of ICDS. Founding director, I think they worked in the program, but real founders are other people, some of whom are in the room and mentioned already. And we have an excellent panel, creme de la creme of Estonian foreign policy, past and present. Starting from the far end, Jonatan Vseviov, Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Jüri Luik, repeatedly a minister, currently Estonian representative at NATO, Riina Kionka, who has spent the bulk of her career working for European foreign policy, but she was Estonian diplomat before that. And Lauri Mälksoo, professor of international law at Tartu University. And we have been given the task by Kristi to discuss events 20 years back and trying to look 20 years ahead. Estonian security. Back then, when ICDS was founded, and 20 years from now. What I can tell you, 20 years flies past really fast. I mean, the opening event that was in Õpetajate Maja, Teacher's House, was like yesterday. Even so, trying to refresh my memory, I actually had a look at the media headlines from 20 years ago. I expected them to be very different and to create impression with a contrast. To my disappointment, headlines are fairly similar. They are not very different at all. I opened the title page of Foreign Affairs March-April issue from 2006, and the headlines were as follows. Seeing Baghdad, thinking Saigon. The last exit from Iraq. Can Hamas be tamed? The backlash against democracy promotion. Ensuring energy security. 2 chairs for expensive oil. Do targeted killings work? The war of unintended consequences, and finally, the man without a plan. I mean, most of these. Most of these you could see today as well, even just change Iraq for Iran. Many people confuse them anyway. I then had another look at Moscow Times, and sure enough, Russia's defense minister Sergei Ivanov on Tuesday said that a report that Moscow had provided information to Saddam Hussein's regime on US troop movements was total rubbish. Yet again, we have similar things in the agenda today. And yet, I think what we actually think and feel today is quite different from what we thought and felt reading these headlines 20 years ago. I think we all realize that we are maybe on the brink or maybe on the middle of a major rupture, and what follows, I'm not sure any of us know. But we are going to try to discuss it. But also, let's discuss our expectations. Jüri, I was thinking about you. Going even further back, in 1994, you signed Estonia joining Partnership for Peace program, and you made a statement where you said that we treat it as our first step towards NATO membership. You were very clear about it. I'm not sure whether the people who initiated Partnership for Peace appreciated that or not. But back then, how did you imagine our future inside NATO? Was your focus on getting admitted and that was the limit of the horizon, or how did you imagine it? I mean, surely not in your worst dreams did you expect Denmark to mobilize troops to be ready to fight United States in Greenland, right?
Yeah, that's true. Well, thank you first for inviting me, Mr. President. It's great to be here, and of course, we should all be very proud of the ICDS and the enormously important work you are doing and we are doing. Well, let me start with a couple of sentences about 94. By the way, the picture of me signing the PFP agreement is on my wall at NATO, which I admit is a bit impolite, but is a great conversation starter. So I can bring my guests to this journey on our getting to NATO and then, of course, being in NATO in various stages. I don't agree with Thomas that in the first years of our membership, we kept our head down because our ambassador to NATO was Harri Tiido. And I think even if we would have given him a direct order, he wouldn't have been able to follow it. Obviously, I presumed that NATO will be very much directed towards collective defense and directed towards protecting us from Russia. Of course, when we joined, I became a real expert on Afghanistan. I have visited Afghanistan 5 or 6 times. And related to that, I wanted to make a point which I think is very important. When we analyze the present situation, I think we must look back at the end of the Cold War. One bloc stayed intact, the other collapsed. But in fact, the Western community was never tested. There was no stress test. We presumed that the West won because the West was inherently better and the other guys just collapsed, which almost automatically meant that our way of life has won, and the best thing we can do is start to improve it even more, to create our small utopia, our small Arcadia, and improve it and improve it and improve it. I think European Union, with all due respect, is a classical example of that. I mean, from the biggest ideas to the absolute nitty-gritty of consumer protection, people are dealing with stuff which, looking at it from today's catastrophic situation, probably wasn't the most important one. And also the internal conflicts which we have in the European Union, they are actually very much based on the principles of culture war. And I think these are very dangerous nowadays, because we are talking about Europe assuming more responsibility, or depending on your level of depression, Europe taking all responsibility and NATO just collapsing, which I don't think is the case, and I can come back to it later. But my question is there Europe? I mean, I think we use the name Europe as a shorthand. I mean, Europe will take over. But is there Europe? I mean, do we have the identity now, the common identity? Do we have common policy? I'm not talking about defense. I'm talking about the general sort of roof of common ideas, common understandings. When it comes to defense, I think we are doing okay in sort of philosophical terms. But even that might quickly disappear once the war ends. I can easily imagine people saying, why should we invest so much in defense? I mean, why shouldn't we run to Moscow and make deals? The consensus which Europe has today on Russia is very much based on the immediate concern, the immediate sort of, I shouldn't say animal-like, but immediate worry about your own life, about your own security. So the question is, what are the tools we are fighting with? And a couple of points about NATO as well. I mean, obviously, as an ambassador to NATO, it would be strange for me to say, well, tomorrow NATO will collapse and my successor, Christian Prick, will be responsible, basically, for that. Because I've kept it up for 5 years at least. But I don't think NATO will actually collapse, as Thomas, Mr. President, said. The NATO as an institution, I think it's pretty sound. It's like, you know, a stone castle, or like an investment. We've invested to NATO from 1949 onwards. So it's a pretty sound investment. And even if there are businessmen who try to sort of destroy it, it still has a lot of living space, a lot of leeway. What I think we should do is to use NATO and to develop our European defense using NATO as a framework, as a structure. And that's what is happening now. Very much the work which we do in developing European defense capabilities is done in the NATO framework. The headquarters, it's all sort of, NATO has it. There's no point of making parallel headquarters, new headquarters. NATO has all of it. So slowly, if we can, we should take it over. But it can be taken over only when we are ready to spend money, when we are ready to seriously invest. And finally, again, sort of coming back to what Thomas was saying, I think it's a fair question whether the Trumpist revolution will survive President Trump. Because even if you talk about this MAGA movement, it's very specifically connected to President Trump. To believe that any other leader can just overtake it and become another MAGA leader, it's not so sure. It's very Trump-specific. I think there is still hope of the United States returning to a more classical understanding of what policy is and what foreign policy is. Because I believe this ideology is non-transferable, because it's not an ideology. It's connected to a person. Person who said, no foreign wars, people supporting that, his supporters. Then saying, yes to some wars, people supporting that. Now saying it will be the end of the Iranian civilization as we know it this evening. I don't know whether people are supporting that, but I'm saying it as an example that Trumpism is a very specific, I would say, a black swan moment in history, because the inherent interest between Europe and the United States still stands. So I have hope. Thank you.
I hope you're right, though I must admit that I was living in Moscow in the early years of the century when Putin came to power, and I saw how Russian political system gave way to him, how institutions crumbled, how easily he could take over parliament, competing political parties, then media, justice system. And to be honest, I haven't done detailed analysis. It's not possible either because these are different systems. But sometimes I ask myself whether the American system offers more or less resistance trying to tame President Trump. And it's not obvious. Jonatan, you are in charge of managing Estonian foreign policy, day-to-day setting strategy. Do you And you started out as specialist in the United States. Do you agree with Jüri that Trump is temporary and we will all go back to where we were, happily?
Yes. No, all joking aside, I obviously agree with Jüri, absolutely. I was thinking back to the days we served together in Washington during those days when ICDS was founded. Actually, we were both in Washington in 2006, I think. And in many ways, yes, the headlines might have been similar to the ones that make the news today, but it was a different world. It was a different world. I mean, is it just me, or it doesn't seem gloomy here? But not just here. When you go around think tank events all around Europe, and not just Europe, all around the world, the atmosphere is gloomy. There's good reason for that, certainly here in Europe. When we keep repeating the facts, and I sometimes wonder whether we understand them. For 4 years now, we're living through the biggest war this continent has seen since 1945. What did we expect? What did we expect? Now, this war will one day be over, so everything is temporary. Every leader is temporary, every organization is temporary, the current war is temporary, it will end. And the future that follows will be shaped by the way the war ends. So yes, we use Europe as a shorthand. We can't use the EU. It's no longer synonymous with Europe because the Brits have left and there are some who are in who maybe don't want to be in. But I think what we really need to recognize is that this, although this is a shorthand, this Europe is being shaped and defined by not just the decisions we take, but by the results we manage to achieve. And in many ways, the Europe of the 20th century was forged in the Second World War and in the immediate post-war years, not just by the Americans. The Americans shaped Europe in part of Europe. The Soviets did it in the other part. And so too will this war and the results we managed to achieve, or the results that the Russians managed to achieve, shape and define the Europe that we'll have. So I think what is fundamentally different from the late 1940s is that due to a number of reasons, one of them being particular political leaders around the world, but there are other more structural reasons. I think this time around, it's on us, Europeans. It's scary, on the one hand, because for the first time in 80 years, we don't have outside powers thinking through the problems for us. We don't have their capabilities that we can count on. We don't have their institutions that we can utilize. I mean, we hopefully will be able to count on their support. The flip side of the coin is that we also don't have, if we succeed in Ukraine, we don't have a dominant Moscow dictating these strategies, policies to at least half of Europe. So it's going to be on us. Now, we worry about a number of things that I think are worthy issues. The shortcomings in terms of military capabilities or institutions. I think the biggest concern that I have when I think about Europe is our lacking strategic culture and self-confidence. And I'll give you just one example. So we have a dual challenge in Ukraine. On the one hand, we need to bring the war to a conclusion that would be beneficial from our perspective, from Ukraine's perspective. On the other hand, we need to shape the post-war future. And we have to do, as the Americans would say, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We cannot all of a sudden sort of arrive at the moment of peace and then start figuring out how to handle it. In many ways, the challenge is going to be similar to what the Americans faced in Western Europe after the Second World War, where without the Marshall Plan, NATO, everything else that President Ilves mentioned, likely the democracies of Western Europe would have collapsed. So it was an outside power that had to put in place some sort of a framework to guarantee Europe's security, political stability, and economic development, eventually growing into the NATO and EU-based structure that we have today. The enlargement of which stabilized Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. Now, it was a huge investment, but eventually that was the basis, the foundational building block of a century that became an American century. Their hegemony, their wealth depended on their success in Europe. So in Ukraine, eventually, we're going to have a situation where, due to the country's enormous geopolitical importance, that's not my invention. Read any writer on European geopolitics, they've outlined the central importance of Ukraine due to its enormous economic, agricultural, military potential. The country will be integrated either into the Russian world, or it will be integrated by us into a Europe that we are reshaping and defining as we go. The problem, again, nobody's going to come up with a strategy for us. So when I usually attend think tank events, I use a thought that I heard mentioned in the opening remarks here before. Our governments are in trouble. We have difficulties thinking through these problems. We have difficulties because of institutional shortcomings. Now, Riina might have a different viewpoint now, and I might defer to that, but I think we have difficulties within the EU thinking through these challenges. And we certainly, and as a representative of the Estonian government, I can sort of honestly admit we have difficulties within the Estonian government. Too big a problem. Focused on the day-to-day stuff, on the walking part, the chewing gum part is left aside. And this is where institutions like the ICDS have to fill in the gap. And, you know, to come full circle and to sort of contribute to the overall gloominess of the atmosphere. It's not as if the think tanks of Europe have grand ideas either. We hear from time to time thought leaders like Toomas Ilves talk about the need for a European grand strategy. When did we last time hear a serious panel on it? Perhaps not here in Tallinn. We're too tiny a city. In Berlin, in Paris, in London. Where's the discussion? Where's the discussion? Where are the PhD dissertations on the post-war, post-Ukraine war, European security, economic or political order? We're falling behind. So I would ask the thinkers in the ICDS to push your colleagues in the Nordic-Baltic world, in Europe writ large. We need to now come up with an ideological, strategic framework. Because whether we have President Trump in office or any future American president, it's unlikely that the Americans will come up with the whole framework and just hand it over to us.
Yeah, good you came back to America, because I asked about America, you chose to answer about Russia and Ukraine. So I was wondering, is that because that's easier to talk about? I mean, our policy is set and it's relatively clear and uncontroversial, unlike some other things, civilization dying first night, or does what preoccupies you mostly these days? Is it Russia and Ukraine, or for instance, where do we get oil for spring agriculture season in Estonia, given that the passage through the Strait of Hormuz is quite closed and airlines are massively cancelling flights already?
So for me, the prism through which I view the world is the war of aggression in Ukraine. And whether or not other policies, activities, developments help or hurt us in pushing Moscow to reassess its Ukraine policy, which is intimately linked to how they view their interests vis-a-vis Europe in general. So, I mean, we've told this. I see a good number of good colleagues here, ambassadors. This is our talking point. I'm not making news here. When we travel the world, we go to Beijing, we call the Gulf states, we talk to the South Americans. We always begin with what is central to our core national interests. It's not to say that we don't have to take positions on other issues, we do. But when we as Northerners say that something is existential, then we're not joking around.
Existential issues are taken seriously, that's true. That's my experience also in the European framework. Riina, it's been often mentioned, repeatedly mentioned here already, that Europe needs to rise to the task. How do you see it? I mean, is that possible, or what tools could European Union have to cope with a new situation? Because, you know, Europe's best foreign policy has been enlargement policy, spreading its values. But now we are dealing with a world that does not want to share our values anymore. So I think we need to find a different method, and it's extremely hard for Europe. I mean, I've repeatedly said that Europe should maybe try to be more transactional in the relationships with non-European countries, make deals such as you don't vote with Russia at the UN and we will give you that. But we are very bad at that transactionalism. As European Union, because it's rule-based, law-based, and all transactionalism can be disputed from that basis. But also individual countries. I mean, for a democratic leader, it's really hard to engage in any deal making, and not all deals are bad. I mean, some are bad, but others are reasonable. But it's hard because you will always have civil society organizations at home who say that, why do you even talk with these people? See what bad things they are doing to our media or women's rights or whatnot. There are always those things. We have seen it even in Estonia. I mean, our former president, Kersti Kaljulaid, visited Saudi Arabia, and she was criticized because Saudi Arabia doesn't observe human rights and they brutally killed a journalist. At the same time, if we could agree with Saudi Arabia that they will increase production of oil so that price falls and Russia can no longer earn, that would be highly beneficial. But that logic is, I mean, it's not in Estonia's powers to achieve a deal like that with Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think Biden tried and failed too. But even so, I could see that for our sort of purist, maximalist, and idealistic audience, the idea that you could have something to discuss with not perfectly good countries, that was quite alien. So, Riina, what are the things that Europe can do?
That was an easy question.
It was.
No, I think if we start, the moment we start talking about not talking about human rights, not talking about international law, we've given it up. We've given up the store. I think that's the foundation that we have to depart from. That's what keeps us together as Europeans, is the values at the end of the day. I think this is the A and the O. You know, transactionalism, there are different ways of thinking about transactionalism these days, certainly. And one of them is something that Alexander Stubb, President Stubb, has talked about, the values-based realism. But you have to have that values in there, otherwise it's a defining quality for the European Union, for Europe as, I'd say, writ large, most of Europe. But it's something that without it, we're nothing, in fact. But I'm reminded of when I look here to the left side of or my left of the panel, then I'm reminded of a party that that Lauri and I went to when we first arrived in Brussels. There were two parties on one night. One was a NATO party, and one was an EU party, one of my colleagues. And we first went to the NATO party, and everybody was kind of buff, and you know they had been in the sun and they were happy and smiling and positive, optimistic. And then we were there for a while. Then we went over to the EU party, the Italian party, and everybody was kind of pale, hadn't seen the sun for some time, and certainly not working out, and they were drinking too much. And I think this is the kind of the optimism versus the pessimism. I fall in on the gloomy side here. I think it must be a different kind of air on the other side of town in NATO than over at the EU, because we see a fundamental break, a fundamental change in the world. This is we're on the brink of a new kind of world order, in fact. It's the idea that there would be an election in the United States and everything goes back to the way it always was. I think this is kind of seen, at least in the EU part of Brussels, as a fairy tale. And a fairy tale we cannot believe in anymore. So what in fact we need to do as a European Union is get serious, get off our rear ends, and get serious about security and defense, ideally within a framework of NATO, ideally using the organizational, the institutions and organizations that have set up to strengthen the European pillar of NATO, using Europe's budgetary and regulatory power. And there's a lot of that. The EU is it's like an ocean liner. Once it's hard to turn, but once it does turn, it doesn't stop. It just keeps going in the one direction. And that's part of the problem that President Ilves referred to as well, the Draghi report. But it's not only the Draghi report, we're talking about the Letta report as well. And all of that stuff needs to be taken much more seriously than in the EU up to now we have been doing internally to get the industrial base going, become more competitive, become more innovative, because this is what powers actually the foreign and security policy as well. And we need to get security and defense going. We're a long way from that. We need those strategic enablers that we're getting from the United States now, but we don't know. We don't have a crystal ball. What's happening next there? So we need those capabilities. We need to get the defense industry going, up and running, so that we can produce on our own if we need to. Ideally, we don't need to, but if we need to, then we need to be in that position. We need to develop those partnerships as well, and we need to work on our internal decision-making processes, 42-7, constructive abstention, that sort of thing. So there's a lot that the EU has to do on the security and defense side, certainly. We're not in a position to defend ourselves these days at all. But there's a lot on the internal market side that needs to be done. And this all has to be done within the rule of law. Otherwise, we're nothing.
Jüri, you had a quick, I hope, two-finger?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an optimist. I'm as gloomy as everybody here in the room. What I'm saying is that NATO is a structure which is usable where the Americans are actively involved or a bit less involved. And I mean, it's all good and dandy to say we are living in a time of massive change. I mean, it's just awful. You cannot imagine how dramatic the situation is. But then the next question should be, and then what? For instance, when it comes to defense, if Europe wants to defend itself, we have to fundamentally rethink in how we do that. How we do that cheaply, nimbly, flexibly, using the lessons from Ukraine. But this needs fundamental rethink. And in today's Europe, there is no special powers or special capabilities to do that. So basically, we are continuing buying the same things, making the same very expensive investments without getting anything, well, I shouldn't say anything, but without getting very little. We are getting very little in return, which would actually allow us to say, okay, within 3 years, we can deter Russia because we have those capabilities and we are ready to do that regardless of the fact that Americans are not with us. It is not the case at the moment. We've talked about it. It's not the case at all. And I think the worst thing is if we sort of create an illusion for ourselves in what we can do or what we cannot do. Of course, if something happens, we have to fight tomorrow, but we also have to keep in mind that if we say that, there are also many European countries who will say, well, let's see, things are not as they should be, the capabilities are not here, etc., etc. So I'm calling for more realism because that's the only way to move forward. And if we believe, and I'm saying it to everybody, if we believe, like many analysts say, war will start in 3 years, then, I mean, I'm saying it hyperbolically, we shouldn't sit here. We should run to our offices and do our utmost so that we would be ready in 3 years. But that kind of urgency, I don't think it's in the air at the moment, at least. I might be mistaken.
Yeah, frankly, I wrote statements. I don't know. I mean, I've been working as a Russia watcher pretty much all my professional life, and it has been my impression that I think Putin had given up on the Baltic states. Of course, he didn't view us as properly sovereign countries. I mean, no small country can be properly sovereign in the sense that he treats it, but being inevitably someone's vassal states, he thought that we are America's vassals, and he had made peace with that. But of course now, we've changed America and so many more uncertainties and risks, I can no longer be sure either. But instead of discussing Russia, I would want us to discuss a little bit also world order. I mean, Riina, you mentioned that world order is profoundly changing. In fact, Estonia, in my view, is a real exemplary product of post-Cold War European order. I mean, we are really the sort of best pupil in class. We democratized, we qualified to join all those institutions. We wanted to democratize. It wasn't sort of imposed upon us, but I think in Estonia, and foreign guests might not know, for a long time at least, the perception in Estonia was that we lost our independence in 1939-40 because we had imperfect democracy, because security wasn't debated among a wider circle of people, but it was a weak president who chose to give away the country, and there was no bigger debate. So in Estonia, security and democracy have been linked very intimately, unlike in many other countries. And you have seen it in internal debates every now and then. When something is perceived to be not democratic, then society senses it and people protest. People want things to be democratic, really and truly, not just legally correct, etc. And that's one feature I have really liked about Estonia. And yeah, unlike many other countries, we have not sort of faked the democratic system in order to join the organizations with their benefits and then do our own thing, cozy up to Putin or MAGA movement, whoever, and you know the country I'm talking about. But now it feels that we did our utmost to join the West, but when we arrived, the West started to crumble. And when we joined NATO in 2004, Iraq war had already started a year before. And let's not debate what role Iraq war did play in crumbling of Western-led order, but it did play some role. So, Lauri, that's what I wanted to ask you. You are a professional of international law and you know more about world order than I do. So why did the post-Cold War order last so little? I mean, it's been 35 years from 91 to today. That's not a very long time, and we could debate when did the order actually start crumbling, but it's a short time anyway. So was there anything the West could have done to make this order more lasting? What was mishandled and where?
Yeah. Well, also hello from me, and I bring greetings from a university that in 6 years turns 400 years old. So we can. I suggest that we take an even longer time perspective. It's the last 20 years. But then there are, for example, also the 20+ years of interwar, Estonia's independence, of which I think this building particularly calls us also to think about, because for example, the Foreign Minister Ants Piip received the call about Moscow's ultimatum in June 1940, exactly in that building where the Foreign Ministry at that time was located. He was also professor of international law at the University of Tartu, so therefore all these aspirations to build our relations on norms, on treaties, we have already had that in the past. So when I have listened also to today's speeches, then I think why these kind of think tanks like ICDS are necessary and legitimate is that, of course, every country deserves their own perspective. There is no universal perspective on foreign policy. We can always discuss this, but at some point, countries have core interests and they might differ. Now, about world order, for me, as merely international lawyer, this is a somewhat confusing term because my impression is that basically everybody has their own concept of what world order is, what it was. For example, international lawyers like to anchor their vision of the normative world at let's say, central treaties, and therefore we would rather start from 1945. But there is, of course, some sort of agreement or understanding that towards the end of the Cold War, when communism falls as project, then there is somehow a chance to maybe fill these UN Charter principles with more liberal ideas. Liberal ideas that maybe existed in the West all along, but we were deprived of. So it's always, I feel a bit irritated when people write superficially that in 1945 liberal order was established. No, it wasn't established here. It wasn't established in Eastern Germany either. So it was. It's unfortunately the other great power made those rules here. And I don't know. I don't necessarily think I think actually, if anything, then these last 20 years have proven that some sort of civilizations do exist. It's probably naive to expect the universality of norms, or that in the end, if one would have been wiser and maybe more gentle with one earlier rivals, then everybody maybe would have accepted some of those liberal norms, such as human rights, more easily. I think there is a diversity in the world which makes different centers of the world to support different types of norms. That is my lesson from studying also extensively, Muscovy's or Russian or Soviet history. Somehow, they basically, most of the time, they oppose what comes from this, at least the liberal West, the England and France kind of West. Although again, this building is very interesting, and I call everyone to look at those plaques because this Vaterland for which these men either fought or fell, you can think about this ambiguity. Is it the Baltic provinces, or is it actually the Russian Empire? Are we sitting in a room that in a certain sense celebrates historically the Russian Empire? So to wrap up my initial thoughts, I think that what we, again, when I listen to, or merely as academic, as a scholar, I listen to foreign policy makers, I feel that foreign policy makers constantly switch between fact, interpretations of history, and morality. And I think for small states, of course, the situation is peculiar and particular because we can always refer to morality. We can say we can say Europe. But the chances are that in some other European regions, these things are understood differently. And it's not necessarily that it is understood in the same way. So what we need is a very realistic doctrine of what it means to be a small state, as a small state, and how to survive as a small state. And I think every reasonable small state in its foreign policy really also thinks ahead wildly. How do we survive in the world, for example, in which NATO is no longer what it has been so far? We have to think about these things. Or even how do we survive in a world where the EU becomes perhaps somewhat different, perhaps also as a consequence when Americans withdraw from Europe. So these are all. Jüri Luik said that we should all be in the office. Well, we can also think about this while perhaps talking today with each other.
Well, I've been wondering, often countries, of course, they have their own position, but they tend to put up with positions of others in order to be part of a system that is overall system is beneficial to them. I mean, they can swallow quite some unpleasantness before they start fighting the system as a whole. And if we look at Russia, for instance, I think Russia has sort of moved full circle. In Moscow, I talked with a member of Soviet delegation when Paris Charter was negotiated in 1990. Estonia was not there. Estonia was behind the door, where Lennart Meri gave a memorable press conference, but we were not in the negotiating room. Russians were, and Russians actually back then, they were most happy to work with Canadian draft of a document because the head of delegation said that Canada has a good draft, so why not work with it? We don't need ours. And they didn't see any problem with what was being negotiated. And then they tried to cope with Western-centric system. And then they sort of tried to secretly start eroding it, pretending they were part of it. And ultimately they went against it publicly. That I think only happened maybe in 2014, not before. So that sort of journey, and I mean, let's maybe not discuss Russia in such detail, but sort of in abstract, I mean, for you as a scholar, what causes countries to stray from the system and start wrecking it like that?
Well, again, I think that, I mean, for big countries in particular that have perhaps a bigger influence over the existence of any system, the system is not the goal. The system is it's a very realist analysis, of course, but the system is one's own survival and one's own position in that. So what I see, for example, we still can't avoid, Kadri, talking about Russia. Russia has been super flexible in the history in taking any concept and giving to it its own content, and also changing the content of this concept, because you mentioned democracy. So actually the Soviet discourse was that the Soviet Union was more democratic than the West. Did you know that? The Soviet discourse was that Soviet republics are sovereign states. Did you know that? So they have basically given their own meaning to core Western concepts of political life, which has also been somewhat confusing, right? And even if you think about, I don't know, Yeltsin being the rival of Gorbachev, they probably have some sort of rivaling concepts of democracy at that time. But I think our worry is not Russia, our worry is Estonia, and our worry is this historical commitment that we have that state since 1918. It's a small state, not in an easy neighborhood. I think when you talk about world order, then often, you know, small states, or what have been considered as small states, have been the victims of world wars. Think of Belgium, think of Luxembourg in the West, or generally Eastern Central Europe, the nation states that were created in 19. So for us, this sort of security problem is a particular problem, historical problem, is really existential problem. It's not, you know, how would it be more fun to be, but it is really that we would exist also in 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Jonatan, how will Estonia conduct its foreign policy in the world where the order is crumbling? I mean, I think it's undeniable, and it's also unclear how fast will it be replaced with some other order that would have some clear distinguishing features. I think for a while it's probably quite confusing. So what are our goals and what are our means? I think goals is actually easier part, but I also wonder about the means. I mean, the question I asked Riina, does European Union have tools to manage in that world? It's true about Estonia as well. I mean, there was a couple of months ago, there was an article about Kaja Kallas, how she manages in Brussels, and there was a quote that made me think. I think it was meant as an insult, and I don't subscribe to insult. I mean, she has one of the toughest jobs in Europe, and she does her very best, 200%. But quote was, she's a cop rather than diplomat. And I think there is some truth in it, in the sense that we are all about, I mean, we consider value-based foreign policy to be important, and the way to do value-based foreign policy is to try to enforce rules, norms, and values that are characteristic of liberal order. That is our way of thinking, and these are the tools, you know, sanction the countries that don't behave, boycott others, try to reward those who democratize. But that can be done, I mean, enforcing the rules can be done as long as sort of these rules are supported by some sort of bigger power. If the rules are invalid, then my ECFR colleague Ivan Krastev said that European liberal elites will soon find themselves in the position Russian communist elite found themselves in 91. You know, everything has changed overnight. And now, it's back. Yeah, so, you know, your full arsenal, ideological and else is gone. You spoke about Leninist principles and suddenly no one cares, etc. So how do you foresee the time of sort of world order confusion?
So to be very, very brief, I mean, I'll list a few things that we certainly won't do, and then go through perhaps some of the things that we're trying to do. So what we won't do is we won't pretend that the world is not what it is. So we'll deal with the world as it is. We won't attempt to hide from history, no matter how scary the situation might seem. We won't allow ourselves to be paralyzed by fear, because we know that there is no good that would come out of it. We'll try to focus on the world as it is, and then on the things that we can do to achieve our core interests. Now, if we accept this hypothesis that the world is changing, everything's changing, then we must obviously also pause for a second and rethink what it is that we want. What's our goal? We're not conducting foreign policy for the sake of conducting foreign policy. It's not an intellectual sort of hobby of ours. It's a necessity, because we, as a small state, arguably depend more on a favorable international system than bigger states do to safeguard our freedom. And when I say freedom, I refer to freedom of Estonia as an independent sovereign entity, but I also refer to freedom inside Estonia, going back to Riina's point on our core values. So freedom has two connotations here. So we are interested in safeguarding or building an international system that would in return safeguard freedom as best we can build it for us here. So what does it mean? It means that there are certain principles we wish to defend. Arguably they are globally relevant, but we're most keen on ensuring that they apply in our immediate neighborhood. Territorial integrity and sovereignty. We have core interests related to those. There are certain things that we don't want to see legitimized. The concept of spheres of influence. No matter how you define it, how you phrase it, it's something that we would much rather not legitimize. Not
in
here.
Europe or also elsewhere?
What's that?
Just in Europe or also elsewhere?
I mean, it's increasingly difficult to avoid accusations of double standards and hypocrisy if we only handle European affairs. So increasingly, I mean, we're forced, we don't want to, but we're forced to take positions on matters that are not intimately or directly related to regional security. And I think you've seen that happen, both in terms of how we conduct our foreign policy, but also in terms of the topics that we speak up on. So that's roughly the framework that we're trying to build here. There are certain areas where these core principles are under direct attack. Jüri referred to war. There's war right now. It's not as if, we're not talking about war in some hypothetical sense. Yes, nobody's attacking Estonia militarily, and I just want to underscore the point here. We see no acute military danger on our borders, primarily because the Russian armed forces are stuck in Ukraine. That's the primary reason why we see no acute military danger. Now, it could also be that we are doing a wonderful job at deterring Russian aggression. Could also be the case. I mean, that's what we're focused on every single day. But the primary reason why there's no acute military danger is because they're all stuck in Ukraine. That war will one day end and shape the future that comes. So that's one area where the international order is under direct attack. There are other hotspots I could point to. And I think observers going down the list of those hotspots, when looking at what Estonia has said and done, we'll see that we have at least attempted to be consistent on those core issues, no matter where the issue sort of surfaces. Greenland or the Middle East. We've tried to be consistent. Now, we haven't done a perfect job because there are dilemmas. There are sometimes extremely difficult dilemmas. Foreign policy does not take place in vacuum. But having also had these conversations with, for instance, our Middle Eastern colleagues, I can put our track record up against theirs any day of the week without shame.
That's nice to hear. On the future of world order, President Stubb, speaking at Riina conference, suggested that actually it will be a non-Western world that will play a bigger part in shaping the future world order. So using the chance that Riina, you are here and you have served as ambassador in South Africa and Pakistan. So what's your view on that? How do non-Western countries like them view the unhappy mess we are here in the West? And do you see some statesman-like thinking on world order coming from there?
Well, the rest of the world is also unhappy. Surprise, surprise. What we refer to as third countries, I'm uncomfortable with this.
There is no good
South.
term, I know.
But countries that have been are kind of in between.
Middle powers, some people say.
Well, middle powers is something else. That's something that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke to as the middle powers needing to get together and define those middle power interests and values as a counterweight, really, to what is being seen as a return to multipolarity. And the multipolarity has never been stable. It's never been safe. It's never been a equation for economic development. But the rest of the world does not want to have to choose between the United States and China. And certainly, if you throw Russia into the mix, Russia is not in the same category as those two, but nobody wants to choose. Certainly from my experience in those two countries you mentioned, the kind of reaction is to make the question bigger, actually. If you can't answer the question within the framework that you have, then you have to enlarge the question. And the way they do this in very concrete terms is enlarging their set of friends, if you will, increasing, showing interest or joining other partnerships, other groupings. That's why the BRICS is growing, for instance. Nobody would say that the BRICS is not dominated by one country, but that's one of the reasons for the expansion. As a counterweight to these other organizations that are not seen as being representative. And this is something that President Stubb talks about in his book as well, The Triangle of Power, that there are problems with the United Nations. We're huge fans. If it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. But there are issues about representation. There are issues about legitimacy. After decades after the thing was set up. And so the European Union does not have a common position on this, so this is as far as I can go in saying something like that. But these are questions that need to be asked, because these are the questions that are being asked by all these other countries out there that we don't even mention. And they are, Pakistan, 250 million people with a nuclear weapon. These are not inconsequential. Just because they're not close to us doesn't mean we should not pay attention to what they're asking for, what they're thinking about, and listening.
Lauri, what's your view on the future world order? When we can expect to see one, if at all?
Yeah, I also read or listened to this Alexander Stubb's Raisina speech and compared to actually Mark Carney's speech from January. So it's interesting that Carney is indeed framing it more from the perspective of middle powers, and Stubb starts with this comparison how small actually Finland is compared to India and makes a joke about that. So in a way he presents a small state perspective. It has already been said for a while that the future world in terms of norms and institutions, it will somehow be more Asian shaped, but I think it's still a lot hidden how it will be, because I think China hasn't probably played all its cards in public, what it really, if it could run the show even more than it does today, then how would China actually change it? And I'm not sure whether they know it themselves, fully. But yeah, I mean, even comparing the last 20 years with these League of Nations, Republic of Estonia period, it's a different world, a different Europe. League of Nations is still so strongly dominated by Europe, and I guess in today's UN, in the General Assembly, the majority is long ago already, non-Western. So that's the kind of world we are at. But at the same time, I think that the West or Europe should also sometimes maintain the capacity to sometimes also criticize certain aspects of the non-Western world in a way that they sometimes tell us about the colonial past of certain European countries and so on. So I think that, even if core elements of the present world order ought to somehow survive in a serious way, then, for example, in an event like Russia attacking Ukraine, I think it's really disturbing to see countries of 1 billion population somehow not saying clearly yes or no. I think that they should be able to say that even if it's a friend.
Our time is soon up, and supper is waiting behind the doors. Jüri, I will leave the last word to you. I think you have the gloomiest expression of all of us. You should be able to come up with a proper ending.
On world order and new world order, I mean, I am skeptical of this dream of conceptualism, that somehow we develop intellectually in our thoughts, in think tanks, an ideal concept of the new world order.
Come on, you wrote an article about the importance of world order from a magazine that I edited for ICDS.
Okay. Good. What I think we should do is, looking from our point of view, looking from the point of view of Estonian security, we should use everything we have to win time, and at the same time make an enormous effort to actually use this time. That's why I'm saying that even if NATO is weaker now, let's use it. Even if the European Union has serious issues because of some countries, let's not be pessimistic about it. Let's use the structures. Even if Orban wins, I'm saying it as an intellectual, even if Orban wins, and even, for instance, if there will be serious problems with 90 billion, which we want to provide to Ukraine, let's think of other ways in providing this money to Ukraine. So let's be very flexible, because these organizations actually provide the framework to be flexible. In EU, it's a bit more complicated because EU has normative powers. So if you want to establish kind of legislative directives, you have to have votes based on the treaties. But still, a lot can be done in the EU framework, even if some countries try to block these activities. And then we should find new sources of power. For instance, the democracies in the Pacific. I mean, I don't think we have found a good formula of involving them in the European security and vice versa, us in the sort of security issues of the Pacific region. There is no organization which would bring us together. I mean, they are partners of NATO, etc., etc. Of course, G7 brings in Japan. But I think we could find ways of being much stronger as global democracies. And we haven't found the key to that yet. And there are other issues I could name. So let's make ourselves stronger, but in a conservative way, using as much as possible what we have already won, what we have already achieved. That's my final comment, or at least final comment from me.
I think with that, we will end our gloomy conversation. Thank you for listening, and happier part of the evening is right over there.